So we're going to go over Iberian women's clothing. And so far what I mean by Iberian women's clothing is the clothing of the three main religious groups of Iberia, the Sephardic Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims of Al-Andalus. And I'll give you a minute if anybody wants to write down. Well, you don't really need to write it down because the handout is available in the class information. The handout is available in the online drives. So if you want to reach me, the easiest way is via Facebook Messenger. My email, I don't check that often, and my spam filter often just makes it so I don't see things. So in the initial section, I go over who lived in Iberia and who contributed their stylistic influences to the clothing that we're going to look at. And I'm not really going to go over this section right now because it takes a little too long in the oral section. But basically by the end, we had a mix of the Sephardi, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Suevi, the Vandals, and then various Muslim groups from the Berbers, the Umayyads, the Almoravids, the Almohads, and then later on in the century, the Romani. And we're going to see that all these different groups interacted and made clothing that was unique from a lot of the other clothing in Europe. And then we have a short section on just some of the different terminology that was around, because people converted back and forth between the religions in Spain. And indeed, a lot of why we have certain clothing prescriptions on what people could wear if they were of the non-dominant religions is exactly because conversions did happen and they were frowned upon. So they tried to make people wear distinctive clothing in the hopes that if they wore distinctive clothing, they wouldn't interact. And if they wouldn't interact, they wouldn't want to get married. And if they didn't want to get married, they wouldn't convert. So that's the reason behind a lot of the clothing prescriptions that we're going to see, is the clothing was prescribed to try to keep people apart exactly because they were interacting so much. So I start in the 10th and 11th centuries because that's when we see the easiest visual evidence and some of the easiest textual evidence to figure out what's going on. When I've looked into the clothing in Iberia prior to this time, it gets really hard to interpret the illustrations, and the textual descriptions get really vague. About all I can tell you so far from my research is they did dress very similar to the Romans of the time, prior to the 10th and 11th centuries. And indeed, even during this time, if you look at the clothing styles, it did look very similar to what would have been worn in Roman areas, even though the Romans aren't really there as much of a presence anymore. So this does start after the Muslims have been a part of Spain for several hundred years. And we're going to follow the religious groups in order that they were established, just because that seemed the fairest way for me to set up an order. And I don't have many pictures in this handout because since this is international, I wanted to avoid copyright issues. I am going to be adding pictures to the handout again after the video has come down, and you will be able to access the link. I just don't want it up when there's an international video out there because I do want to make sure that I keep it to fair use for copyright. So for the Sephardi in Iberia during this period and most to follow, I can't find many mentions of what they wore. A lot of it was very similar to what they would have been wearing in the Christian and Muslim kingdoms. So if they lived in the Christian kingdoms, they would look similar to this lady. If they lived in the Muslim kingdoms, they would look similar to this lady. And we're going to look at the layers that they would have worn. For this century and most to follow, the first layer would have been the camisa. And it would have been, to begin with, and indeed for some time to come, fairly simply constructed of triangles and rectangles. The fabrics mentioned and the fabrics we have in the few extant camisas that have survived are mostly linen and cotton. If you could afford it, it would be white. If you couldn't afford it, it would be unbleached linen or cotton. Over top of this, you would wear the tunica, and it could be pleated or plain. And as you can see in the illustration, if you were well off, you would wear multiple layers of tunica so that it showed off the layers underneath and showed that you could afford more fabric. And then over top of the tunica, you would wear the manto, which is just a very large rectangle or semicircle, large enough for you to wrap around your body and envelop yourself. In Al-Andalus, in the beginning, this area was ruled by the Umayyads, and the influences were Syrian. And then later on, we had the Taifa kings and the party kingdoms. And then the influences varied a bit, but we also had the Almoravids, and we had more Berber influences. During all of this time, it was less frequent for Spanish women to veil than for Muslim women in other areas. And we have, for the first layer, again, the camise, which shows a similar verbal exchange of words for chamise and camise to be so similar. And from what I can tell, the Muslim camise was cut similar to the Christian style, only it had a keyhole neckline. And one of the things we see in the Spanish necklines is that they were very small, and a lot of this was the Moorish influence. And if you look at the drawings, we did draw them the way that we see them in illustrations and on the few extant items, that they would be straight at the back and a very small semicircle in front, just enough to get your head through. So the layer to wear over the camise would be either the hubba or the durra. And you would probably wear the durra if you were more well off and could afford the buttons and the brocade. We didn't even draw the zihara, which is another robe worn by nobles, because even the textual descriptions we could find for it were too vague. Now, as I said, Muslim women in the Iberian kingdoms didn't veil as much as Muslim women in other territories, but there were a variety of veils they could put on. So you would start with a lifafa, which is basically like a headscarf or a cap that you put around your head to anchor all your other veils to. Over top of this, you have the option of the litham to go over your face, which would be semi-sheer. And then the kimar or the mikna to wrap around your head. And then over all of that, you would have the mihar, which is again a very large rectangle or semicircle that you would wrap around your body to envelop you.
So we did have a question about the dura.
What's a dura?
Jenny asked, is the dura totally open or only where the buttons are placed?
We are not exactly sure where the buttons were from the textual description. Our guess from other Muslim garments at the time was half down, but honestly, for women's garments, it may have been all the way to the floor. We could only find a men's garment that looked like it was probably the dura. So this is a bit conjectural because there are no images of women's ones showing. So buttons could be just to the waist or it could be all the way to the floor. Does that answer that question?
I believe so. Someone else said that they couldn't understand the difference between the camisa and the tunica.
Basically, the camisa goes next to the body, and that's your bleached or unbleached layer. The tunica is cut pretty much similar, only a bit longer, and that's your layers of colored fabric. It would more likely be of wool or silk. And if you look at Our Lady that is done at the end, you really wouldn't see her camisa showing at all. These are layers of tunica showing. She has a pleated tunica underneath and a shorter tunica on top. The camisa is basically like your underwear. It goes next to your body and takes the dirt and the sweat. Was there any more question on that?
Following up on the first question, Jenny asked, or she said, even if the buttons are only half down, is the rest of the way open or is it seamed up under the buttons?
It is a buttoned garment. That's part of what makes it different from the hubba. We do not know, we can't tell from the text if it would have been open down the front or not. All it says is it was a button garment. So I'm afraid there just isn't enough of the description to tell you whether it would have been seamed or whether it would have been opened. On the male garments, they are then open from below the buttons. Uratim, who taught a class on the Muslim clothing only, may know more. She has done further research into the Arabic only clothing. But I can say from the text that I read, pretty much all it said about the dura was that it was a richer garment than the hubba, that it had buttons, and that it could be made of brocade or stamped with gold or be solid. And I'm afraid that's all I have to go for because there aren't visuals.
Excellent, thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry there isn't more information. And as I said, we didn't even draw the Zahara because all it says is that it's a robe worn by nobles. And we really couldn't figure out what that would mean. So within these territories, what would make the Sephardi a little bit different is they wouldn't wear garments that were mixed of linen and wool. And what that means is you couldn't wear them that were mixed weavings. And you also couldn't wear garments that depended on each other, that were linen and wool. So if you had a linen stocking, you couldn't tie it with a wool garter and knead it to support it. But you could layer your wool tunica over your linen chemise. Another thing that would be a little bit different is that instead of Christian women that would show a little bit of their hair under their veils. Jewish women, if they were married, would cover all of their hair. Most of the Sephardi women, Sephardi people during this time lived in the Muslim territories. The rules were usually pretty slack and not very strictly enforced. And the only mention made of specific things that the Sephardi had to wear were sometimes honey-colored patches for the servants, or the minak or the zunar, which is a honey or yellow colored belt. So those were really the only differences for the Sephardi during the 10th and the 11th centuries. During the 12th century, they followed the same general clothing rules. The rules in the Muslim kingdoms got a bit stricter. They were also required to wear certain colors, especially the servants. Usually the nobility could get out of any of the rules until it got really bad. And the most common color required to be worn was honey or yellow. The patches had been moved from being required only by the servants to being required for some other statuses as well. And again, the Sephardi were mostly in the Muslim kingdoms during the 12th century. For the Christians, very few of them lived in the Muslim territories during the 12th century. So there really weren't any different rules for Christians. The styles during the 12th century for the Christians were strongly influenced by Byzantine styles. Let me take a break for a drink a second.
And just so you know, we're about 20 minutes in.
That's good. Whoop, went a little too far. So again, the layers are the camisa from previously. Over top of it, the word for the first layer of your garment, that is your wearing garment, has changed. And these would be colored usually out of wool or silk. And it's called the brial or the saya. And a lot of these name differences are because in Iberia, the different Christian kingdoms spoke several different languages. So frequently you have multiple words for the same garment. The brial or the saya was cut similarly to the tunica from previous. It could be party colored as well as solid, which is fun. So if you're wearing it on its own, you can party color it. And it could also have ornate decoration at the wrist and the hem, especially if it's being worn as the first layer.
So speaking of colors, Emma asked, is there any ideal as to why yellow or honey rather than any other color?
That was the most popular color that was identified with Jews in Muslim kingdoms during most of the Middle Ages. It was also the color that was used most often for Jews in Christian kingdoms. Interestingly, the color for Christians in Al-Andalus when they were present was blue. And there is one period that we'll talk about where they required Jews to wear a different color. But basically it depends on which Islamic sect is in control of Al-Andalus, what color they require, because it changes based on the rules in the Muslim sect that's in control. And in the Christian kingdoms, it's a general European practice that it was associated with yellow. The books I've read about it are Jewish, and they haven't theorized as to why it was yellow. I know I've heard in Christian myths that it was yellow to associate with the Jews being moneylenders, but that feels a little bit like a myth to me. because they weren't always money lenders, especially way back at the beginning in the earlier centuries. So I think there must be a different reason for it to be yellow. And I would suspect that we would find that in why the Muslim kingdoms chose yellow for Jews and blue for Christians.
Thank you.
But your other options for clothing, if you wore the brial or the saya, you were probably wearing higher class clothing. And over top of it, you would put the piel or the pelaison. And they were called that because they were usually lined in fur to keep you warm. If you were wearing less ornate or more comfortable clothing, you would wear the tunica. And that was loose like it was in the previous century, while the piel and the pelaison were fitted. And the piel could have very wide angel sleeves, anywhere from just a little bit wide to barely fit your, or to show off your undersleeve, to long enough to almost drag on the floor. With this, they would wear on their head a veil, and it would be rectangular, but it would be draped in such a way, and we'll go back to Our Lady. It would be draped in such a way that it looks like it's a round veil with a round cutout from the head. But I found illuminations from the era that show corners and show that it's clearly a draped rectangular veil. If it's opaque, it's called a toca. If it's sheer, it's called an impla. And you'll see as we go on that almost everything that goes on the head is called a toca. And over all of that, you have again your rectangular or semicircular manto. In Al-Andalus, we see the Almohads take over, and they're a more fundamentalist group, and they enforce the clothing rules a lot more stricter. And we see less ornate clothing, less patterns, less colors, and a bit more modesty. So you would more commonly see women veiling during the 12th century in Al-Andalus. And their garments are pretty similar to what we had before. We have the kamis, which is cut like before. We have body garments for the legs, which would again be undyed. Your kamis and your body garments next to your legs are for keeping you clean. So you would have sarawil, which are your pants. And these are straight leg. They're not the poofy param pants people think of when they think of Islamic clothing. They have just a straight leg. And over top of your sarawil, you would wrap your leg wrap, your tarabeek. And we're gonna see the tarabeek over the years get puffy, and these horizontal lines around the leg get exaggerated for effect. Then you have a couple options. If you were poor, they borrowed the saya from the Christians to be a shaya, which is cut narrow with minimal fabric. If you're well off, you have your haba, which might have fake tiraz. It is unlikely that women would have actual tiraz, but there's little fake tiraz rectangles that you can see on women's garments. And during this time, you'll see that the sleeves of the haba get nice and wide and can be decorated at the sleeves and the neck.
So we did have one question. It says, how did you determine that the sirwal had straight legs?
It's written in the description, and I think that there might have been extant. But I remember it was written in one of the books that I read that it said that they were straight and not poofy and not tapered. And I'd have to go back and see which source I read it from. I'm not sure which it was. I have an annotated bibliography at the back, so it would probably be in one of those sources. I'm afraid I haven't gotten around to footnoting each thing yet. So there's the dura again. And again, we don't know exactly how the buttons work. It says in the handout that the drawing of it is conjectural. And the veils work the same as before, only now we have the addition of the isaba or the taj. The isaba is mentioned of being usually of fabric, but it could also be of metal. The taj is mentioned of being of large metal plates sewn onto the fabric. We didn't even know what the izar was. It says it's a long rectangular wrap draped in a variety of ways and can be pulled across the face. Not sure what size, probably similar to the malhafa, but what's different about it? Are they different fabrics? We have no clue what the difference is between the izar and the malhafa. Were there any more questions on the 12th century? Okay.
That's it.
Were you going to say something, Lorenzo?
No, I said I think that was all the questions so far.
Okay. So during the 13th century, stuff gets weird and fun. Most of the Christians at this time moved to most of the Sephardi at this time moved to the Christian kingdoms because the rules there were better. In the Muslim kingdom, the rules about the dhimmi or non-Muslim became pretty strict. And this is the time, let me double check. Nope, not yet. But the patches formally required for servants became a requirement for all Jews, and exceptions would be pretty rare. And there's still the minak or the zunar that was sometimes required to be worn. In the Christian kingdoms, you might need to wear the patch, but most of the time during the 13th century, rules for Jews were very favorable. This is described as the golden age for the Sephardi and the Muslims in Spain. And it's interesting that the 16th century is described as the golden age for the Christians. But if you study the other cultures of Spain, they talk about that term in regards to the 13th century. And we have some really beautiful illustrations of interaction from Alfonso X in books that he had illustrated. So one of the funnest things that we see because of the interaction that happened is the fun headdresses that the high noble women wear. And if you look at them as they're developed, they start off with strips of pleating wound around the head like a turban. Because the 13th century, of course, is the era when the Muslim women sometimes start wearing turbans. And the Christian women had their take on it too. So it starts by being wrapped and low to the head. And then later on, they wrap it around a vellum frame and it gets high on the head. This one that I'm showing would be a saddle-shaped toga. Everything on the head is a toga, almost. And it's held in place with bands around the head and under the chin. And those pleated strips, we have an analysis of extant strips that have been found. And that's in the bibliography. And it's really beautiful to look at because you can see how thin the silk was that was woven and how they wove in strips that could include metallics, gold and silver, and it could include colors and red and blue and green and yellow. And these could be really vibrant, extravagant headdresses. And that's one of the really neat things we see from the interaction of the Muslims and the Christians in Spain at this time. So as I said, things get weird in the 13th century. A lot of people are confused by the layers. So if you look, this lady is wearing a simpler costume, and this lady is wearing a fancier costume. The layers split depending on whether you go simple and fancy. If you wear a simple camisa, then you wear a simple loose brial or saya, possibly with trim, and a simple loose brial or saya, possibly with buttons over top, and possibly a loose peyote with fairly modest sleeve openings over top. If, however, you want to go high noble, you have the option of a camisa encordada, which is laced to pull it snug to your body and might show a little skin. And we have the extant dress of Leonora de Toledo that shows us how these were laced. And we tried to give you images that would show it. Basically, they take what is similar to a bias strip or a rolled strip of fabric, and they put it on the inside edges of the garment, and they tack it down at intervals to create loops. And then through those loops, you spiral lace your cord. Does that make sense to people? Can people let me know if I should explain that more, or does that make enough sense to understand it? It's one of the simplest and easiest to sew methods of closure, and it is almost invisible, so it's a really great closure method. Unfortunately, the Iberians appear to have abandoned it in the 14th century, so it's really sad. And then that camisa encordada for cords, could also be margomada, embroidered. And they'd embroider it all along the top of the sleeve to the neck, and then in a square fashion around the neck. And it's that square fashion around the neck because their underdress, we didn't get the illustration to show it quite enough. The underdress could be cut very narrow at the sleeves and could show off the embroidery down the bodice and along the sleeves. So this could be cut even narrower so that you see that chest embroidery, and it could just cover really the nipples, or it could be cut wider. So you've got a camisa margomada that can show a little skin, and then you've got your brial or your saya that can be sleeveless with a laced gap, or sleeved with a laced gap. And then over top of your brial or saya, if you were a fancy noblewoman, you could have either a peyote that is really narrow in a strip down the front, or a peyote that's really narrow in a strip down the front with long, ridiculous pendant sleeves. And I think that's how, nope, we didn't draw this lady with ridiculous pendant sleeves. But your peyote, if you were being fancy, would basically come between your breast so that you could see some of the brial over top. And then on top of it, you have a variety of toca. Anything opaque is going to be a toca, only the sheer one is an impla. So even though this is a rectangle and these are piles of ruffled strips, all these three are toca as long as they're opaque, and that one's an impla. Any questions on the Christian clothing of the 13th century?
I don't see questions, but just so you know that there's about 20 minutes left.
Yep, we're good. I've only got one more to Andulsi and one more to go. So in second part of this, as we said, the Nazarids gain control. When they gain control in the second half, fancy garments are popular again. So we start off with things being simple, And then towards the end, things are fancy again, and veiling of women is again much less common than in other Muslim countries. So we're gonna look at our layers. And the images I draw of the Muslim women and the Christian women, honestly, often show them as you would see them if you were hanging out with them in their house. For both the Christian and the Muslim and the Sephardi women, if they were to go out of the house, they would take that last garment that I mentioned and wrap up in it. And they wouldn't necessarily cover their face unless they were being particularly modest, but all of the three main religions would wrap up in a garment when they left the house so that they were covered and so that they could cover their face if they wished. There was a bit of a outdoor modesty culture for women across Iberia. Sorry, cat. So most of what I did was I drew the women as though they would show up if you were hanging out in a house or in a courtyard with them, so that you could actually see the layers rather than just enveloping cloth. So we know a little more about the layers during this time. We have a couple options for pants. We have the sarawil or the zaraguel, and they could be cut similar to before, only now they're cut extra long so that they puddle in horizontal layers. And I will tell you, every one of us that has tried to make these pants, they don't just puddle naturally. You have to put a gathering stitch on the seams. So while the texts just say that they puddle in horizontal layers, your ankle is narrower than your knee. So they all puddle down at your ankle unless you put some sort of stitch to hold some of them up top. So we're not sure exactly how these were constructed to provide the look that the text mentioned. But yes, another option now is also a short zaraguel that basically looks just like a pair of shorts. And both of these, again, are white or undyed, but a really fun thing is the cords can be woven of really beautiful patterns and very richly decorated. So that's a fun thing. The pants might be white and plain, but the cords can be very fun. Over this now, because the culture that is in control of Al-Andalus has changed, we have a couple changes in words. So the leg wraps are now called harwab, but they function similarly to before. You have two options for your kameez. Cut pretty much the same, though a bit closer to the body. And now it can also have embroidered patches on the shoulders and embroidery around the neck. And all of these things, they might have it in previous times as well, but we don't have any documentation of it, so it's hard to tell. The gila, the sheer undergarment, was more popular than the opaque kameez during this time. Then you again have the shaya or the hubba. It mentions that the shaya was worn more often by upper classes now. It wasn't just a poor woman's garment. And then you also have the misha, which had flared sleeves. And then you have, again, your various veiling options, which were not required, but were something that you could wear, especially if you went outside. And one of the fun things that we see starting now, which will eventually turn into the chopins that someone else is teaching about, are the quab or the cork, which are platform sandals made with cork soles. So we get the chopins from the Muslim cultures of Spain, because they're the ones that started wearing those sandals in their bathhouses. So we've just got one more to go. Any questions on the 13th century?
There is lots of conversation, but no questions so far.
Okay. So we have the previous rules as before for what the Sephardi could wear. Persecution during this time in the Christian kingdoms was strong. So if they could, they moved into the Muslim kingdoms. They were required to wear the honey-colored badge. They were not supposed to wear costly clothing or rich fabrics. And they also could no longer use Catholic names. So that's an important thing to know for SCA purposes, or any reenactment where you choose a persona, is that after 1371, if you're portraying a Sephardi person, there are no more Catholic names. And it really wasn't good to live in the Christian kingdoms because you could be beaten in the street. They say that while the Muslim kingdoms did have a lot of clothing rules for the Sephardi, it was not as much of a physical risk as the Christian kingdoms. And there's some fun things that we see that we have now images of, because there are a few Christian paintings of Sephardi that survived from the 14th century. And there is a Haggadah from Barcelona that survived that has lovely images that shows how the Sephardi saw themselves. And that's an important distinction to make when you're looking at images from Iberia, because most of the images that survive are images of how the Christians depicted the Sephardi and the Muslims. And because there was prejudice, you have to be careful how you interpret those depictions. And there's only a few very rare sources that we have, because so much was destroyed during the Reconquista, of how the Muslims and the Sephardi saw themselves. So that's an important factor when researching these subjects. And one of the fun things I found when I looked at the Haggadah is something that none of my modern Sephardi friends know what it is, and I'm going to need to talk more with Sephardi scholars. It's this headband thing. And in the Haggadah, it's always depicted as gold. It can go under the chin or around the back of the head, and it has this round shape that can look like one flat round or stacked flat rounds. And I found it in a couple images of women, some paintings, and also from the Haggadah. And it's really interesting because it doesn't show up on anyone but the Sephardi women. So I'm very curious as to what that is. And what you're seeing here is a headdress called the cofia y trenzado. And it's a style that was very popular in the Christian kingdoms. And so the Sephardi women in the Christian kingdoms wore them. But we'll see when we look down at the Christian ones, they were worn so that they came back on the head and showed hair a little by the Christian women. Whereas in all the depictions of the Muslim women, both in the Haggadah and the Christian depictions of them, they wear them so that their ears and all of their hair are covered by the top kofia part. And when they do that, they come to a point. And I'm not sure if that was a specific Sephardi style to make the kofia come to a point, or if it was just the easiest way to get it to cover all your hair, or what. I still need to do more research on that. But they did wear them distinctly different from the Christian women because of that rule of covering all their hair.
So
So
there,
those, yes,
there is a question. It says the head bubble thing.
yes.
Some sects of Orthodox Jews have the men wearing something of the same profile that has a piece of Torah text under it. I wonder if there's any kind of connection.
We have wondered that because I came across that in the books in general about Jewish costume. So we wondered if the Sephardi women were mimicking that male headdress. And it's definitely something that I'm going to look into when I can talk to Sephardi scholars that know more about it. But unfortunately, so far, no one has known anything definitive about it. But I definitely think that's, I mean, the people I've talked to said no way would a woman do that, especially back then. But, you know, that faith is not my faith. I can only go by the people I know whose faith it is and are telling me this, but they're also not medieval scholars of the culture. So it's definitely an interesting theory. And I'm going to look into it more.
You have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, we'll wrap this up as quick as we can. So the Christian women's styles were very similar to those in the rest of Europe. We see them now wearing the shorts from the Muslim women. And the books on Christian women's clothing say that Iberian women wore underwear the earliest in Europe because of the Muslim influence from Al-Andalus. We also see now calzas, which are the stockings. The camisa is cut pretty much the same as before. We have the dress, which is the saya or the gonella. And now the arms are cut different. They're shaped into the arm side instead of just the rectangular construction. And they can be curved on the sides and laced on the side to fit. We definitely have pictures showing side lacing. And in Iberia, for the Christian women, side lacing was much more common than front. We have a couple options for going over top of the first saya. You could wear a garment with buttons, and there are images with the buttons going all the way to the floor and all the way up the back of the arm. You could wear the famous Spanish party color, where the party color is either on grain or on the bias. And this was also done with stripes. There is still the peyote from before. And then just other versions of what are still called saya or gonella that could have hanging tippet sleeves or shorter sleeves. And then as we were talking about the cofia y trenzado, which could be a loose bag, it could be fitted, it could be done like a cap, and it could be done in separate pieces. We have images of the trenzado, the braid casing on its own, and we have images of the cofia on its own with sleeping women. And then we're gonna look real quick at the women from Al-Andalus. We have a different culture in charge now. The main differences, the pants are still the same. They now have stockings for the legs called terabik to make those folds that are so popular. The camise is now different. It's short and split down the front. There's a garment called the maluta that's different than the garments before. It's a bit shorter. It could come to mid-calf, and it could be party colored or it could be solid. And then over the maluta, you would wear the atabe. And that could have sleeves or it could be sleeveless, and it could have a collar. And we do see this one in the images most likely buttoned all the way to the bottom. So probably the dura would button all the way to the bottom as well. So I think that we probably need to change that illustration. And then the headdress changes a little. It looks like it's a half circle veil, but I'm honestly not sure. With some kind of, The scarf that ties it on definitely has volume. It looks like a padded roll or a very thick scarf, and it wraps around itself at these edges. And then over the top layer now is shaped and called an almalafa, and it can have a fringed hem. And we've gone through all of our stuff through the 14th century. Does anyone have questions?